Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. The moss had grown over Ashley Nguyen's abandoned pack in patterns that should have taken months, not 3 days. Thomas O'Brien knelt beside it on the Ho River Trail, his Garmin GPS reading 47.597 degrees, 123.935 degree OW, elevation 578 feet. The pack sat upright against a Sitka spruce, partially obscured by sword ferns that seemed to have deliberately arranged themselves around it. 3 days. He'd helped coordinate the initial search when Ashley's hiking partner reported her missing at the ranger station. 3 days, and the pack looked like it had been there since the Clinton administration. The moss wasn't the worst part. The worst part was how the pack faced the trail, positioned as if Ashley had set it down carefully, methodically, before walking into the temperate rainforest. No signs of struggle, no torn fabric, no scattered belongings creating a breadcrumb trail for searchers, just the pack and the moss that shouldn't exist. Thomas pulled a latex glove from his duty belt. His hands didn't shake. They hadn't shaken in 8 months, not since the medication started working. Dr. Brennan at the VA would be proud. He opened the pack's main compartment with the detached efficiency of someone who'd done this before, someone who'd found things in the woods that shouldn't be found. Ashley's permit placed her as a 26-year-old environmental science graduate student from UC Berkeley. Experienced hiker. 10 essentials all accounted for. First aid kit, fire starter, extra clothing, headlamp with fresh batteries, map and compass, knife, emergency shelter, food, water purification tablets, and a space blanket still in its wrapper. Her phone sat in a waterproof case, fully charged but showing no signal. Normal for this section of the Ho. The screensaver was a photo of Ashley with an older couple, presumably her parents, in front of Half Dome. Thomas bagged the phone and the permit. The rest would stay for the evidence team Chief Ranger Morrison was sending from Port Angeles. He stood, knees popping, and scanned the surrounding forest. The Ho rainforest received 140 inches of rain annually, creating one of the most lush temperate rainforests in the continental United States. Sitka spruce, western hemlock, and western red cedar grew to massive proportions here, their trunks wrapped in moss and lichen. Nurse logs lined the trail, decomposing giants that fed new generations of trees. Everything green, everything wet, everything alive. Except the silence. Thomas had worked Olympic National Park for 12 years. He knew the soundscape. Varied thrush calls, Pacific wrens, Townsend's warblers, the constant drip of moisture from the canopy, the whisper of the Ho River a quarter-mile north. Now, nothing. Even the river seemed to have stopped flowing. He activated his radio. Station, this is O'Brien. Found the Nguyen pack at mile marker 4.7, Ho River Trail. Requesting evidence team and asking to expand search radius to 5 miles. Static answered him. He checked the radio, a Motorola XTS 5000, Park Service standard, fully charged, correct frequency. He tried again. Station, do you copy? More static, but underneath it something else. A rhythm, almost like breathing. Thomas turned the radio off and back on. The breathing stopped. He told himself it was interference from the moisture from the density of the forest. He'd heard stranger things on the radio during his 12 years. Once, on a search and rescue operation near Hurricane Ridge, every radio in the team had picked up what sounded like a child singing. Turned out to be feedback from a weather station in Canada, distorted by atmospheric conditions. Rational explanation. Rational explanations. Dr. Brennan had taught him to reach for those first. Before the other thoughts, the ones that wanted to pull him back to 2012, back to the Quinault search. He marked the pack's GPS coordinates in his notebook. He still kept a paper backup, old habits from before digital everything, and continued up the trail. Ashley's hiking partner, a graduate student named David Chen, had last seen her around 6 p.m. on October 23rd. She'd told him she wanted to walk ahead, that she needed some time alone to clear her head. David had continued at his own pace and assumed she'd set up camp at their planned site near 5 Mile Island. When he arrived at 7:15 p.m., no Ashley, no tent, no sign she'd ever been there. That was 3 days ago. They'd found nothing in the initial search. No footprints leaving the trail, no broken vegetation, no clothing snagged on branches. It was as if she'd evaporated. Fourth one in 18 months. Thomas tried not to think about that. Morrison had specifically told him not to think about that. They're not connected, O'Brien. Different circumstances, different locations, different times of year. But they weren't different enough. All experienced hikers. All alone when they vanished. All disappeared between sunset and full dark. All during new moon phases. The trail curved east, following the river's contour. The canopy thickened overhead, reducing the October afternoon light to a dim green twilight. Thomas's watch read 4:47 p.m. Sunset would come at 6:08 p.m. He had 90 minutes before he needed to turn back. That was when he saw the first one. It stood 30 feet off the trail between two massive Sitka spruces, not quite shaped like a person, but person-adjacent. A vertical darkness that the forest's natural shadows couldn't explain. It didn't move, didn't react to his presence. Just stood there, a column of black that seemed to absorb light, rather than be created by the absence of it. Thomas stopped walking. His training said to investigate. His instincts, the ones that had kept him alive through 12 years of wilderness work, said to document and extract. He raised his Park Service camera, a ruggedized Canon point-and-shoot, and took 3 photos. The click of the shutter sounded abnormally loud in the silence. When he lowered the camera, the shadow was gone. Thomas walked to where it had been. No footprints in the moss, no disturbed vegetation, no broken spider webs or displaced moisture droplets. Nothing to indicate anything had stood there at all. He took more photos of the ground, the surrounding trees, the angles of natural shadow fall. His hand stayed steady. Dr. Brennan would be very proud. The breathing sound from the radio had started again, even though the radio was off. Thomas pulled it from his belt. The power button was in the off position, LED dark, but the breathing continued, soft and rhythmic, like someone sleeping or waiting. He removed the battery. The breathing stopped. He looked at his watch, 5:03 p.m. Sunset in 65 minutes. Time to head back. The trail back seemed longer than it should. The marker posts, placed every 1/10 of a mile by the Park Service, appeared in the wrong order. Mile 4.8, then 4.9, then 4.7, then 5.1. His GPS said he was walking northwest, back toward the trailhead, but the markers disagreed. Thomas stopped at marker 4.7, the location where he'd found Ashley's pack, but the pack wasn't there. Neither was the spruce it had been leaning against. Instead, a western red cedar stood in its place, ancient and massive, its trunk easily 12 feet in diameter. The shadows between the trees had multiplied. Thomas counted 15 of them, arranged in a rough circle around his position. The same vertical darkness, the same light-absorbing quality. They didn't move, but the space between them and Thomas felt like it was contracting, the way distance warps in extreme heat or cold. His hand found his service weapon, a Glock 22 .40 caliber. 14 rounds. He'd never fired it in the line of duty, never needed to. The most dangerous things in Olympic National Park were usually lost tourists and the occasional black bear. This, whatever this was, fell outside his training parameters. The shadows moved closer. Not walking, just closer. One moment at 30 feet, the next at 25. No transition, no movement through space. Simple displacement from one point to another. Thomas backed away slowly, keeping his eyes on them. His heel caught on a root and he stumbled, catching himself against a moss-covered nurse log. The shadows stopped advancing. They seemed to be watching, evaluating. The word came to him unbidden. Observing. His radio's breathing had returned, loud enough now to hear even without the battery. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a sound with no apparent source. Thomas's psych training, part of the return-to-duty protocol after Quinault, identified the symptoms: auditory hallucination, visual disturbances, spatial disorientation, classic signs of a psychotic break. But his hands weren't shaking. His thoughts were clear. The fear he felt was appropriate to the situation, not the overwhelming panic that had characterized his PTSD episodes. This was real, or real enough. The sun slipped below the tree line at 6:08 p.m. exactly, and the shadows moved again, 15 to 30 in an instant. They surrounded him now, a perfect circle 20 feet in diameter. In the dying light, Thomas could see them more clearly. They weren't entirely without form. Suggestions of human shape emerged from the darkness. The angle of a shoulder, the curve of a head, the length of an arm. But wrong, somehow. Proportions slightly off, like reflections in water disturbed by ripples. One of them stepped forward. The movement was smooth, organic. Nothing like the displacement from before. It approached until it stood 5 feet away. Thomas could see nothing inside the darkness. No eyes, no features, no defining characteristics. Just absence. Then it spoke. Not out loud. The words appeared directly in Thomas's mind, bypassing his ears entirely. The sensation was profoundly wrong, intimate in a way that made his skin crawl. Observer. What did you do with Ashley Nguyen? Thomas kept his voice steady, professional, radio discipline, even in madness. Witness. Where is she? The shadow tilted its head, a gesture that might have been confusion or amusement. The movement revealed something Thomas hadn't noticed before. Where the shadow stood, the ground showed no moss growth, no vegetation, no signs of life. The earth itself looked desiccated, gray, dead. Watching, always watching, as she watched. I don't understand. Doors. She opened doors. The other shadows moved closer, tightening the circle. Thomas could feel the temperature dropping, his breath beginning to fog. His watch showed 6:23 p.m., October 26, 2014. He focused on those details, anchoring himself in the concrete and measurable. What doors? Between. The spaces between. Where we wait. Where we have always waited. Thomas's psychology training included a semester on cultural anthropology, understanding the belief systems of the various tribal nations around Olympic National Park. The Kino, the Quilut, the Maka, they all had stories about entities that existed in liminal spaces, things that watched from the edges of firelight, beings that weren't quite spirit and weren't quite flesh. Shadow people, some anthropologists called them, documented in dozens of cultures across every continent. Are you going to kill me? The shadow that spoke tilted its head the other direction. Kill? No. Killing is not watching. Watching is eternal. Then what do you want? See us. Bear witness. Know that we are here, have always been here, will always be here. In the spaces between the trees, in the darkness between thoughts. Watching. The circle contracted to 10 feet. Thomas could see more details now in the full darkness. The shadows weren't uniform. Some appeared more solid, more defined. Others flickered and wavered like projected images. Behind them, deeper in the forest, he could see hundreds more. Thousands. A silent army of watchers extending back into the trees as far as his eyes could penetrate. His radio spoke with his own voice. Station, this is O'Brien. Found the Nguyen pack at mile marker 407. Then Ashley's voice, desperate. David? David, I can see something in the trees. There are shapes. Then another voice, a man's, unfamiliar. Jesus Christ, what are those things? They're everywhere. Then a woman's voice, thick with tears. Please, I just want to go home. Please let me go home. The radio cycled through voices, dozens of them, all reporting the same things. Shapes in the trees, shadows that moved, presences that watched. Some of the recordings sounded old, degraded, possibly from the 1970s or 1980s. Others were crystal clear, recent, 4 disappearances in 18 months. How many total over the decades? How many witnesses had the forest claimed? The shadow spoke again. Ashley Nguyen saw us, truly saw, perceived, understood. She could not look away, could not unsee. Now she watches with us. Eternal. Show me. The shadows parted, creating a gap in the circle. Beyond it, Thomas could see a figure standing motionless between two cedars. Even in the darkness, he recognized the silhouette from Ashley's permit photo. She stood perfectly still, facing him. But something was fundamentally wrong with the way she held herself. Too rigid. Too still. No breathing. No weight shift. No micro movements that characterize living things. Thomas approached slowly, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The light hit Ashley's face and his stomach dropped. Her eyes were open but completely black, no white visible, as if the pupils had expanded to consume everything. She didn't blink, didn't react to the light. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor, not quite the color of death, but not the color of life either. Something between. Ashley Nguyen? She didn't respond, didn't move. But her lips parted slightly and words emerged in a voice that sounded like it was coming from underwater, distorted and strange. I see them. I see all of them. In the corners of vision, in the spaces between heartbeats, in the darkness behind closed eyes. They've always been there. We just don't look. Can't look. Won't look. But I looked, and now I can't stop looking. They're beautiful, Thomas O'Brien. So beautiful and so terrible and so eternal. Where are the others? The other three who disappeared? Ashley's head turned toward him with mechanical precision. Her black eyes reflected his flashlight beam like a cat's, throwing back a pale luminescence. Here. We're all here. Watching with them. Adding our eyes to theirs. Seeing what they see. Time doesn't pass the same way here. Sometimes it's 2014, sometimes it's 1982, sometimes it's 1956. All the moments exist together, layered like transparency sheets. I can see you in 2012, Thomas. I can see what happened in Kino. I can see what you're trying to forget. Thomas's hands finally started shaking. Don't. The little girl, Sarah Dakota, age 7. You found her after 3 days, but you were too late. Exposure and dehydration. She died in your arms while you waited for the helicopter. You still hear her asking for her mother. You still feel the exact weight of her body going slack. Stop. That's why Morrison sent you on this search. He thinks you need closure. He thinks finding Ashley alive will help you heal. But Ashley isn't alive, Thomas. Not in the way you mean. Ashley is transcendent now. Ashley is eternal. The shadows closed in again, and Thomas felt the profound wrongness of their proximity. His flashlight dimmed as if the batteries were draining, though he'd replaced them that morning. The darkness pressed against him, viscous and thick. Ashley continued in her drowning voice. They exist in a state of pure observation. No thought, no emotion, no desire. Only watching, only witnessing, only bearing eternal testimony to the passage of time. They've watched the mountains rise and erode. They've watched species evolve and go extinct. They've watched humans discover fire and split atoms. Always watching, never interfering. We give them our eyes, and in return, we become part of something infinite. That's not life. That's not existence. That's peace, Thomas. It's peace. No more trauma. No more memory. No more weight. Just observation. Pure and simple and eternal. The shadows formed shapes now, becoming more defined. Thomas could see faces in them. Dozens of faces, maybe hundreds, all with the same black eyes, all with the same expression of serene emptiness. Young and old, male and female, different ethnicities and time periods, all watching. One shadow stepped forward, and Thomas recognized the features despite the darkness. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, with long black hair and a Seattle Mariners t-shirt. Sarah Dakota. No, you're not real. She's dead. I was there. I held. The shadow Sarah spoke in that same underwater voice. You held my body, but I wasn't finished. I watched you cry. I watched you blame yourself. I watched you break. And now I watch everything, always. It's better this way, Thomas. No more pain. No more fear. Just watching. Thomas backed away, his service weapon in his hand now, though he didn't remember drawing it. The shadows didn't react to the gun. They simply watched, patient and eternal. His radio spoke again, this time in Morrison's voice. O'Brien returned to station. Immediate. Weather front moving in. But Morrison's voice sounded wrong, distorted, like it had been processed through multiple layers of recording and playback. Thomas checked his watch. 6:47 p.m. He'd been in the woods for 2 hours since finding Ashley's pack, but it felt like minutes. The speaking shadow addressed him again. Observer. Will you watch? Will you see? Will you bear witness? What happens if I refuse? You leave. You forget. You return to your life of suffering and memory and wait. But you will know we are here. You will feel us watching. In every shadow, every darkness, every moment of solitude, you will know. And if I accept, peace, eternity, observation without end. No more pain, Thomas O'Brien. No more Sarah Dakota's weight in your arms. No more screaming in the night. Only watching, only seeing, only being. It was tempting. God help him, it was tempting. 2 years of therapy, 8 months of medication, countless sleepless nights replaying those 3 days searching for Sarah, the moment of finding her, the helicopter that came too late, the weight that never left. Thomas looked at Ashley, at the serenity in her inhuman face, at Shadow Sarah, no longer cold and small and dead, but eternal and observing, at the hundreds of watchers stretching back into the infinite forest. They offered an end to suffering, an end to being human with all its terrible consciousness and capacity for pain. His finger found the trigger, but not pointed at the shadows, pointed at the ground. He fired once, the muzzle flash illuminating the circle of watchers for a fraction of a second. In that brief light, Thomas saw them more clearly than before, saw the anguish beneath the serenity, the trapped awareness behind the empty eyes, the prison masquerading as transcendence. No, the shadows recoiled from the sound of the gunshot, the first noise to break the silence in what felt like hours. Thomas fired again and again, emptying the magazine into the earth. Each shot pushed the watchers back, creating space, restoring boundaries. When the echoes faded, the shadows had retreated to 30 feet. The speaking shadow tilted its head one final time. Your choice. But know this, observer. We are patient. We are eternal. We will watch you. Always. In the darkness between moments. In the spaces between thoughts. We will watch. And when you are ready, when the weight becomes too much, we will be here. The shadows dispersed into the trees, and Thomas found himself alone on the Hoh River Trail. His GPS showed his correct position, mile marker 4.7. Ashley's pack sat against the Sitka spruce exactly where he'd found it. His watch read 5:23 p.m., less than an hour since he'd discovered the pack, but his service weapon was empty, 14 spent casings scattered around his feet. His radio battery sat on the ground, removed. And when he raised his camera to check the photos he'd taken, every image showed the same thing: the trail, the trees, and hundreds of vertical shadows watching from between the trunks. Thomas gathered the spent casings, evidence, though, of what he couldn't say. He secured Ashley's pack for the evidence team, marking the location carefully. As he walked back toward the trailhead, his radio remained silent, even with the battery reinstalled. He filed his report that evening. Pack located. No sign of Ashley Nguyen. Search ongoing. He didn't mention the shadows, didn't mention the voices, didn't mention the choice he'd been offered. The camera's memory card suffered a corruption error during evidence processing. All photos lost. Nobody questioned it. Technical failures happened constantly in the field. Ashley Nguyen was never found. Neither were hikers 2, 1, or 3 from the previous 18 months. The disappearances stopped for a while after that night. Though Thomas knew it was temporary, the shadows were patient. They had all the time in the world. Thomas continued working Olympic National Park. The medication kept the panic attacks manageable. The therapy helped him process Sarah Takoda's death. He learned to live with the weight, to carry it without breaking. Some nights he woke to the sound of breathing from his turned-off radio. Some days he glimpsed vertical darkness between trees that natural shadow couldn't explain. And every time, he remembered his choice. Dr. Brennan called it progress. Morrison called it dedication. Thomas called it bearing witness. Not to the shadows and their eternal observation, but to the reality they represented. That some things in the deep places of the world existed in states humans weren't meant to perceive. That consciousness could be trapped as easily as freed. That eternal observation was just another word for eternal imprisonment. He carried that knowledge the way he carried Sarah Takoda's memory. Heavy, yes. Painful, certainly. But his. Human. Real. On November 15th, 2014, 20 days after Ashley's disappearance, Thomas received a package at the ranger station. No return address, postmarked from Forks, Washington. Inside was a digital camera memory card and a note in handwriting he didn't recognize. She wanted you to see. She wanted someone to know. Thomas inserted the card into his computer. It contained a single video file, time-stamped October 23, 2014, 6:18 p.m. Ashley Nguyen's face filled the frame, illuminated by her phone's screen glow. Behind her, darkness. Between the trees, vertical shadows, hundreds of them. Ashley spoke directly to the camera. "If you're watching this, I'm gone. Truly gone. Not dead. Something else. There are things in these woods that don't show up on any maps, that don't appear in any field guides. They've been here longer than the trees, longer than the mountains, maybe longer than the sky itself. They watch. That's all they do, but it's enough. They watch, and sometimes people watch back. And once you truly see them, once you acknowledge their existence, they never let you look away." She paused, tears running down her cheeks. "I'm not brave enough for what comes next, but I'm too curious to run. That's always been my problem. I see something impossible and I have to understand it. I have to know. So I'm going to look, really look. And whatever happens, I need someone to know it was my choice. Tell my parents I love them. Tell David I'm sorry for walking ahead. Tell whoever finds this that the shadows are real, and they're waiting." The video ended. Thomas watched it 17 more times that night, studying every frame, looking for something he could explain, some rational answer he could offer. But all he saw was a young woman making an impossible choice, trading her humanity for a glimpse of eternity. He copied the video to a secure drive and deleted the original from the evidence system. Some truths weren't meant for official reports. Some knowledge would only create more victims, more watchers, more eternal observers trapped between existence and void. Thomas O'Brien continued his work. He searched for lost hikers and educated tourists about bear safety and maintained trails through ancient forests. He took his medication, attended his therapy sessions, and slept through most nights without nightmares. The shadows watched from the spaces between trees, patient and eternal. He acknowledged them, but he didn't look back. That was the compromise, the boundary, the line he chose to hold. Because Dr. Brennan was right about one thing: carrying the weight was hard. Living with trauma was exhausting. Remembering Sarah Takoda hurt every single day. But it was human. It was real. It was his. And some things Thomas had learned were worse than pain. Some things were worse than memory. Some things lasted forever. On December 21, 2014, the winter solstice, Thomas O'Brien submitted his report on the Ashley Nguyen case. Official conclusion: lost hiker, presumed deceased, body not recovered. The report included standard language about vast wilderness areas, animal activity, and the harsh reality that not everyone who entered the forest came back out. The report did not include shadows. It did not include voices, it did not include the choice. But as Thomas filed the paperwork, he could feel them watching. In the corner of his vision, in the space between his heartbeat and his breath, in the darkness at the edge of every light. The shadow people, the eternal observers, the patient witnesses to all of human suffering and triumph. They would always be there now. Thomas had looked, and they had looked back. And that, he understood, was the actual horror. Not that they existed, not that they offered escape from pain, but that they were patient. Infinitely, terribly patient, waiting for the day when the wait became too much. When the memory of Sarah Dakota's last breath finally broke him. When the suffering of consciousness outweighed its value. They would be there, in the spaces between, watching, always watching. Thomas left the office at 5:47 p.m., sunset already fading into winter darkness. As he walked to his truck, he passed a stand of Douglas firs at the edge of the parking lot. Between two trunks, a vertical darkness stood slightly deeper than natural shadow should allow. Thomas didn't look directly at it. He unlocked his truck, started the engine, and drove home through the long December night. Behind him, between the trees, the shadows watched. Patient, eternal, waiting. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. The ravens had been following Marcus Reeves for 3 miles, and they wouldn't land. They circled overhead in perfect silence. No caws, no wing beats audible over the wind. Just black shapes wheeling against October clouds like debris caught in a slow vortex. In 16 years as a ranger, he'd never seen ravens refuse to land. They landed on everything: corpses, garbage, fresh kills. But not today. Today they just followed, staying exactly 40 feet above him, as if something on the ground was worse than whatever hunger drove them. Marcus stopped on the trail, his Garmin GPS map 62s, showing 6,147 feet elevation, 2 miles from where Kayla Morrison's Subaru still sat in the Highline Trail parking lot. The air temperature had dropped 11 degrees in the last hour, and his breath came out in plumes that hung too long before dissipating. The cold felt wrong for late October, even at this altitude. It pressed against his skin like something with weight, with intention. He'd transferred to Glacier National Park 8 months ago, after what happened at Mount Rainier. After Sarah. The words of his therapist echoed, "You need distance, Marcus. Geographic distance from the trauma." But standing here now, watching those ravens circle, he wondered if distance meant anything when the problem was inside your own head. The last known ping from Kayla Morrison's iPhone had come from this section of trail 4 days ago at 4:37 p.m. 26 years old, solo hiker, graduate student in ecology from the University of Montana. Her parents had reported her missing when she didn't return Sunday night. Standard search protocol: check the vehicle, hike the intended route, look for signs of injury or deviation. Marcus had done this dozens of times. He knew the rhythm of it, the way most missing hikers turned up with twisted ankles or dead phone batteries, embarrassed and grateful. But the ravens wouldn't land. Marcus keyed his Motorola APX 6000 radio. Reeves to base. Static. Then Linda Kowalski's voice, the park dispatcher. "Go ahead, Marcus." "I'm at mile marker 7 on Highline. No visual yet. Air temperatures dropped significantly. Visibility's still good, but weather's turning." "Copy that. We've got a front moving in faster than predicted. Wind advisory starts at 1800 hours. Marcus checked his watch. 3:42 p.m. Less than 2.5 hours of decent light left, and the temperature was already hovering around 28 degrees. He'd packed for cold, but this felt different. The kind of cold that made your teeth ache, that seemed to bypass your clothing entirely. "Reeves, you still there?" He realized he'd been staring at a tree 30 feet off the trail. The bark had been stripped in long vertical gouges, the exposed wood underneath pale as bone. Too high for elk, too deliberate. "Yeah, I'm here. Listen, I'm seeing some unusual markings. Might be nothing." "What kind of markings?" Marcus approached the tree slowly. his boots crunching on frost-stiffened grass. The gouges were deep, at least an inch into the wood. They started about 7 feet up and ran down to the base. 4 parallel marks, then a gap, then 4 more. Like fingers. Claw marks, maybe. But the spacing's off for any animal I know. A pause. You want me to send Hendricks out? Marcus thought about Dave Hendricks, 58, 26 years with the Park Service, steady as they came. A second pair of eyes would be smart, but something made him hesitate. The ravens had started circling lower, and their silence was beginning to feel less like coincidence and more like warning. Negative. I'll keep you posted. Reeves out. He took photos of the tree with his department-issue Canon, then continued up the trail. The path here ran along the edge of a significant drop, hundreds of feet down to the valley floor. To his left, the mountains rose in serrated peaks, their faces already dusted with early snow. The Continental Divide cut through this landscape like a scar, and Marcus had always felt the weight of that geography, the sense of standing on the edge of something vast and indifferent. His phone had no signal, which was expected, but his GPS was acting strange, the arrow indicating his position drifting in small circles, even though he stood still. He tapped the screen twice, watched it recalibrate, then start drifting again. Equipment malfunction, probably. Cold affecting the electronics. Except the Garmin was rated to -4 degrees Fahrenheit. Marcus found Kayla Morrison's first cairn at 4:03 p.m. It wasn't one of the official trail markers. Someone had stacked 7 rocks in a neat pyramid just off the path on the valley side. The top stone had been painted with something dark. Marcus initially thought it was blood, but when he examined it closely with his flashlight, the substance looked more like charcoal mixed with some kind of oil. A symbol had been drawn on the rock's flat surface, a circle with 3 lines radiating outward, and what might have been letters or pictographs he didn't recognize. He photographed it, then noticed the second cairn 20 feet further on, then a third. They formed a line leading away from the trail, down a steep embankment thick with Douglas fir and lodgepole pine. Marcus knew the protocol. Stay on established paths during search and rescue. Don't deviate unless you have clear evidence the missing person went that direction. But he also knew that Kayla Morrison had been missing for 4 days in wilderness that could kill you in 4 hours, once the sun went down. He started down the embankment. The temperature dropped further as he descended. His thermometer, clipped to his pack strap, read 24 degrees now. The trees closed in overhead, blocking what remained of the afternoon light. Marcus switched on his Petzl headlamp, the LED beam cutting through shadows that seemed to move just beyond its range. The cairns continued. 7 rocks each, always 7. The symbols on top varied, but they all had that same unsettling quality. Not quite random, but not quite organized into anything Marcus's brain could parse as language or meaning. At the 9th cairn, he found Kayla Morrison's day pack. It was partially buried under a thin layer of snow, but the bright purple fabric was unmistakable. Marcus felt his pulse quicken as he pulled it free. The pack was lighter than it should be. He unzipped it carefully, mentally cataloging the contents. 1 empty Nalgene bottle, a granola bar wrapper, a park map with a route marked in pencil, and a small leather journal. No phone, no wallet, no keys. Marcus opened the journal. The first several pages contained field notes about lodgepole pine regeneration patterns after fire disturbance, Kayla's graduate research. The handwriting was neat, methodical, but the later entries devolved into something else. The notes became fragmented. The ranger at the visitor center warned me about the North Trails. Said 3 hikers disappeared last spring. Said it's always the North Trails. Something wrong with the temperature. My thermometer showed 68 degrees an hour ago. Now it's 31. Weather Service said clear skies all week. I keep seeing the same tree. I know that's impossible. I've been hiking east, but every 20 minutes, I pass the same twisted pine with the split trunk. I marked it with chalk the second time. The mark is still there. The final entry was dated 4 days ago, the handwriting barely legible. They're not ravens. They look like ravens, but they don't move right. They don't make sounds. I counted 17 of them, and they're all watching me, and I think I understand now what the ranger was trying to tell me. I think the north trails aren't the problem. I think north is the only direction you're allowed to leave from. Marcus felt something cold slide down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. He keyed his radio, but got only static. The signal should have worked fine at this distance, even in the trees. He tried again, adjusting the squelch. Nothing but a hiss that sounded almost like breathing. He clicked his GPS. The screen was blank. Marcus took a breath, held it, let it out slowly. This was the moment his therapist had talked about. The moment when his brain would try to make connections that weren't there, would try to see patterns in random data because that's what trauma did. It made you look for danger in every shadow. But the shadows were moving. He swept his headlamp left and saw them. Dark shapes between the trees, tall and impossibly thin, standing motionless. His light passed over them and they didn't react, didn't move. Just stood there in the spaces between the pines, and Marcus counted 4, then 6, then lost count because they all looked the same, and they were all facing him. His hand went to the canister of bear spray on his belt. He knew, rationally, that these were probably just trees. Shadows cast at strange angles by his headlamp. Pareidolia, the human brain's tendency to see faces and figures in random patterns. But they were breathing. Marcus could see it now. Could see the subtle rise and fall of their chests. Could see the vapor of their breath in the frigid air. And they were too tall, 7 feet at least, their proportions wrong, their limbs too long and joints bending at angles that didn't match human anatomy. He took a step backward. His boot landed on something that cracked like kindling. When he looked down, he saw the bones. They were scattered in a rough circle around the 9th cairn, half buried in the snow and dead pine needles. Too many bones, too varied in size. A pelvis that might have been elk. A skull that definitely wasn't. Ribs, dozens of them, some still connected by desiccated cartilage, and something that looked like a human femur, except it had been split lengthwise, the marrow cavity scraped clean. Marcus's training kicked in even as his hands started shaking. This was a scene. Evidence. He needed to document it, preserve it, radio it in. He needed to. The figures between the trees moved. They didn't walk. They glided, their feet never quite touching the ground, closing the distance between themselves and Marcus with impossible speed. He got a clear look at one of them as it entered the sphere of his headlamp's beam, and his mind tried very hard to reject what his eyes were reporting. The thing had the approximate shape of a human being, the way a child's stick figure has the approximate shape of a human being. Technically correct, but missing something essential. Its skin was the color of frostbite, gray-white and pulled tight over bones that protruded at sharp angles. Its face was the worst part. The eye sockets were too deep, too dark, and inside them, something moved that caught his light and reflected it back in amber. But it was the teeth that made Marcus run. The thing's mouth hung open in a perpetual silent scream, and its teeth were all wrong. Too many of them, filed to points, stained with something dark and organic. When it breathed, the sound was like wind through a cave system, hollow and ancient. Marcus crashed back through the underbrush, his headlamp beam bouncing wildly. He could hear them behind him, not footsteps but something else. A sound like branches scraping against ice. His lungs burned with cold air, and his rational mind tried to assert itself. These are people, this is a cult, this is something explainable. But his trauma-trained hindbrain knew better. His hindbrain remembered Sarah's last radio transmission, the confusion in her voice, the static that sounded like screaming. He burst onto the main trail, his momentum carrying him forward. The ravens above scattered for the first time, their silence breaking into harsh cries that sounded almost like warnings. Marcus risked a glance back and saw the figures at the tree line, 7 of them now, standing perfectly still, watching. The temperature had dropped to 19 degrees. Marcus ran for 2 miles before his legs gave out and he collapsed against a boulder, gasping. His radio had started working again halfway up, Linda's voice cutting through with increasing concern when he didn't respond. He'd managed to gasp out something about finding evidence, about needing backup, about the temperature anomaly. What he didn't tell her was that he'd seen them, the Wendigos. The word had come to him from somewhere in his memory, a lecture at the academy maybe, or a documentary he'd half-watched. Algonquian folklore, spirits of winter and starvation, creatures of insatiable hunger that had once been human but had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Bullshit. Mythology. Stories told around campfires. Except those things in the trees hadn't looked like stories. Dave Hendricks met him at mile marker 4 with a thermos of coffee and a concerned expression. Jesus, Marcus, you look like you've seen a ghost. Linda said you sounded bad on the radio. Marcus wrapped his hands around the thermos, trying to force warmth back into his fingers. He'd been shaking for the last 20 minutes, and it wasn't just from the cold. I found Morrison's pack, and some kind of scene. Bones. Lots of bones. Dave's expression shifted to professional concern. Human? I don't know. Some of them, maybe. It was... Marcus stopped himself. What was he going to say? It was guarded by nightmare creatures that looked like they'd stepped out of a medicine man's vision quest. It was getting dark. I need to go back with proper gear. And backup. Did you mark the location? Marcus pulled out his GPS. The screen was working again, showing his route in a neat red line. But when he scrolled back to where he'd found the pack, the track became a confused tangle, like he'd been walking in circles. Something's wrong with the GPS signal down there. Heavy tree cover, maybe. Dave studied him for a long moment. How long since you've taken a couple days off, Marcus? There it was. The question Marcus had been dreading since Mount Rainier. How long since you've had a break? How are you sleeping? Have you been taking your medication? All the gentle probes that meant, we're not sure if we can trust you anymore. I'm fine, Dave. I know what I saw. I'm not saying you didn't see something, but this job, especially after what you went through, it can play tricks. The mind tries to protect us by making sense of the senseless, and sometimes it makes connections that aren't really there. Marcus wanted to argue, but he'd had the same thought. That's what made it so insidious. His therapist's voice in his head. PTSD can cause hallucinations, especially under stress. Your brain is trying to reconcile what happened to Sarah by finding patterns, by making it make sense. But Sarah hadn't been a hallucination. Sarah had been his partner, and she'd disappeared on a routine trail check, and they'd found her 3 days later at the bottom of a ravine that she had no reason to have been anywhere near. The official report said she'd fallen, become disoriented, suffered a head injury. But Marcus had read the autopsy report, the part they didn't include in the official findings. The part about the bite marks. I need to go back, Marcus said. Tomorrow, first light, with a team. Dave nodded slowly. I'll clear it with Henderson, but Marcus, if we don't find anything, then I'll take that vacation everyone keeps suggesting. They hiked back to the trailhead together, Dave keeping up a steady stream of conversation about normal things. His daughter's college applications, the roof repair on his cabin, the elk migration patterns this year. Marcus tried to engage, tried to pretend his mind wasn't replaying the image of those figures gliding between the trees, their two long limbs and hollow breathing. The parking lot was empty except for their vehicles and Kayla Morrison's Subaru. Marcus's truck thermometer read 42 degrees, normal for late October at this elevation, as if the last 4 hours had been a dream. He sat in his truck for a long time after Dave left, engine running, heater blasting. His hands had finally stopped shaking. The radio chatter was routine, a couple checking into Granite Park Chalet, a hiker with a non-emergency question about bear activity, Linda going through the end-of-shift protocols. Marcus pulled out his phone and did something he'd promised his therapist he wouldn't do. He searched for information about Sarah's death. The official Mount Rainier incident report was brief and bureaucratic, but diving deeper into local news archives, Marcus found what he was looking for. A small article from a Seattle alt weekly that the Park Service had managed to get pulled from most mainstream outlets. The journalist had interviewed a Puyallup elder who lived near the park boundary. The elder had talked about the Stick Indians, spirits of the forest that led people astray, about how there were places in the deep woods where the rules were different. where things that should stay buried sometimes walked around. The article ended with a quote that made Marcus's chest tighten. The rangers don't like to talk about it, but they know. Every park has them. The trails where people disappear. Always the same trails. Always when the temperature drops. Marcus closed his phone and stared at Kayla Morrison's Subaru. There was a parking permit on the dashboard dated 6 days ago. A University of Montana decal on the rear window. A bumper sticker that read, "Not all who wander are lost." His phone buzzed. A text from Linda. "Henderson approved your request. Team of 5s, 0700 tomorrow. Get some rest." Rest. As if he could sleep after today. Marcus drove back to his cabin as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and bruise. The ravens followed him for the first 3 miles, then peeled off all at once as if they'd escorted him to some invisible boundary. He spent the evening going through his field guide to North American wildlife, trying to find anything that matched what he'd seen. Bears didn't move like that. Mountain lions didn't stand upright. Wolves didn't have those proportions. He knew this was futile, knew he wasn't going to find a biological explanation in a field guide, but it gave his hands something to do besides shake. At midnight, Marcus gave up on sleep and drove back to the park. He told himself he was just checking equipment for tomorrow's search. But he found himself parked at the Highline trailhead again, staring at the dark mouth of the trail. The temperature was 26 degrees. Marcus got out of his truck, which was stupid. He had no authorization for a night search, no backup, no real plan. But his body seemed to be operating on its own. Some part of his brain that had been in command since Sarah died now making decisions without consulting the rational parts. He pulled on his pack, checked his headlamp, and started up the trail. The night was perfectly still. No wind, no animal sounds, just his boots on frozen ground and his breathing in the dark. The beam of his headlamp created a small bubble of visibility, beyond which the darkness felt absolute, textured, almost solid. Marcus reached mile marker 7 and stopped. The ravens were back, invisible in the darkness but present. He could feel them overhead, could sense the weight of their attention. His GPS was malfunctioning again, the screen showing his position as a blur of possible locations. The temperature had dropped to 17 degrees. He found the embankment and started down, following the route he'd memorized during his panicked retreat. The cairns appeared one by one in his headlamp beam, their symbols seeming to glow faintly in the LED light. At the 9th cairn, the bones were still there, but something had changed. They'd been arranged into a pattern, a spiral that led inward to a cleared space where the snow had been brushed away, revealing dark earth underneath. In the center of the spiral was a satellite phone, Kayla Morrison's, judging by the bright purple case that matched her pack. Marcus approached slowly, his bear spray ready even though he knew it would be useless against what he'd seen in these trees. The phone's screen was cracked but still functional. He pressed the power button and the device flickered to life, showing a single unsent text message in the composition field. "They're not killing us. They're waiting for us to become like them. I can feel it happening. The hunger. I haven't eaten in 3 days, but I'm not hungry for food anymore. I'm hungry for something else. The cold doesn't bother me now. Nothing bothers me. I understand what they are. I understand what I'm going to be." The message was addressed to a number Marcus didn't recognize. Timestamp: 3 days ago, 11:47 p.m. A sound behind him, that scraping ice sound, made Marcus spin around. The figures were there again, closer this time, close enough that his light caught details he wished it hadn't. Their ribs were visible through translucent skin. Their fingers were too long, the nails thick and yellowed like horn. And their eyes. Those weren't eyes at all, but empty sockets where something else lived. Something that looked at him with an intelligence that was alien and ancient and starving. One of them opened its mouth wider than any human jaw should open and spoke. The voice was like wind through dead trees, like ice cracking on a frozen lake. But the words were English. She tasted the cold. Now she belongs to winter. Marcus's mind fractured a little at that moment. Part of him, the trained ranger, the rational man, tried to find an explanation. Audio hallucination, exhaustion, mental breakdown. But another part, the part that had been growing since Sarah's death, accepted what his eyes and ears were telling him. There were things in the world that didn't fit into the neat categories of his training. There were places where the normal rules didn't apply, and he was standing in one of those places right now. "Where is Kayla Morrison?" His voice came out steady, which surprised him. The figure tilted its head at an impossible angle. In the cold, in the hunger, in the space between heartbeats where the body realizes it's already dead, another figure emerged from the trees. This one was different, more recent, its transformation less complete. It still wore the tattered remains of clothing, though the fabric hung from a frame that had been stretched and distorted. Its face retained some human features, but they were sliding away like wax near a flame. The thing that might have been Kayla Morrison reached out with hands that had grown too many fingers, and Marcus saw that she was holding something, a human femur, split and scraped clean, exactly like the ones scattered around the cairn. "The hunger," she said, and her voice was more human than the others, but fading fast. "The hunger never stops. I ate everything, all my food. Then I ate the bark off trees. Then I ate the pine needles. Then I found the bones and I ate those too. And they tasted so good, Marcus. They tasted so good and I wanted more, and then they came and they showed me where to find more. And I'm so hungry. I'm so hungry all the time." Marcus took a step back, then another. His training was screaming at him to help her, to attempt a rescue, but his survival instinct knew better. Whatever Kayla Morrison had been, she wasn't that anymore. "The cold is mercy," the first figure said. "The cold ends the confusion. The cold makes the hunger make sense." The temperature had dropped to 11 degrees. Marcus could feel ice forming in his beard, on his eyelashes. His breath came in desperate gasps that burned his throat. And with the cold came the hunger. It started small, just an awareness that he hadn't eaten since breakfast. But it grew with terrifying speed, becoming a gnawing ache in his stomach. Then a consuming need that pushed every other thought aside. Food. He needed food. He'd give anything for food. He'd do anything. Marcus's hand went to his pack, pulled out an energy bar with fingers that were going numb. He ripped open the wrapper and shoved the bar into his mouth, but it tasted like sawdust, like nothing, like it couldn't possibly satisfy the hunger that was expanding inside him like a living thing. "The cold changes the appetite," the figure said. "The cold teaches new hungers." And Marcus understood. This was how it happened. This was how the transformation began. Not with violence, but with need, with a hunger that normal food couldn't satisfy, with cold that rewrote the body's priorities until survival meant abandoning everything that made you human. He thought of Sarah, wondered if she'd felt this same hunger in her final hours, wondered if she'd given into it. But Sarah had taught him something in their years as partners. She'd taught him that the moment you gave up, the moment you accepted the impossible situation, was the moment you lost. So Marcus did the only thing he could think of. He ran. The figures didn't chase him. They didn't need to. The cold was the chase. The hunger was the chase. And both were gaining ground with every step. Marcus crashed through the underbrush, his headlamp beam bouncing wildly, his lungs screaming. The hunger was so intense now that it was making him dizzy, making him see things that weren't there. Movement in the corner of his vision, shapes that might have been more of those creatures, or might have been his mind unraveling. He burst onto the main trail and kept running, his GPS completely dead now, navigating by instinct and desperation. The cold was pursuing him like a physical thing, like it had mass and intention. His thermometer read 7 degrees, then 4, then 1. At mile marker 3, Marcus fell. His legs simply stopped working, the muscles seizing in the cold. He lay on the frozen ground, watching his breath come in short gasps that didn't seem to contain enough oxygen. The hunger was everything now. He could think of nothing else. It owned him completely. And he understood why people gave in, why they became like Kayla Morrison, like those figures in the trees. Because the hunger promised relief. It promised an end to the need. All he had to do was accept it, let it in, let it teach him what to eat. But in his pocket his phone buzzed. No signal, no connection, but the alarm he'd set was going off. 6:30 a.m. Time to start the search with Dave and the team. That tiny piece of normal reality, that mundane alarm clock, cut through the hunger like a blade through fog. Marcus forced himself to focus on it, to remember that there was a world outside this cold, outside this need. A world where alarms went off and people made breakfast and search teams assembled to look for the lost. He pulled himself to his feet, his body screaming in protest. The cold had retreated slightly, not gone, but less immediate. The hunger was still there, but he could think around it now, could recognize it as the weapon it was. Marcus staggered toward the trailhead, his headlamp battery dying, the first gray light of dawn beginning to leak into the eastern sky. Behind him, he could hear that scraping sound growing fainter, as if the things in the woods couldn't follow him past some invisible boundary. He reached the parking lot as full dawn broke, the temperature climbing rapidly to 38 degrees. Dave's truck was already there along with 2 others, the full search team assembling as planned. They looked at him with expressions that shifted from concern to alarm as he got closer. "Jesus Christ, Marcus," Dave said, grabbing his arm. "You've been out here all night, your lips are blue, you're hypothermic." Marcus let Dave guide him to a truck, let someone wrap him in an emergency blanket, let the questions wash over him without really answering. He was alive. He was out. The hunger was fading, replaced by normal, manageable human hunger that could be satisfied with normal human food. But it would come back. He knew that now. The cold had touched him, and once touched, you were marked. Once you'd felt that hunger, some part of your brain would always remember it, would always know that there was something else out there, something that couldn't be satisfied by anything you'd find in a grocery store. "We found her," Marcus said finally, his voice raw. "Kayla Morrison. Or what's left of her. She's gone." "Gone how?" Linda had arrived, her dispatcher efficiency sharp even in the field. How did he explain? How did he tell them that Kayla Morrison had transformed into something that was no longer human, that she was out there in the woods with others like her, waiting for the cold to bring them more victims? How did he explain without sounding like he'd lost his mind? "She didn't make it," Marcus said. "I found evidence. We need to recover the body." But when they assembled the full team and headed back up the trail, 6 rangers, 2 park police officers, proper equipment and daylight, they found nothing. The embankment was there, the slope where Marcus had descended, but there were no cairns, no bones, no spiral pattern in the dirt, just undisturbed forest floor and the usual scatter of natural debris. Dave found Marcus's boot prints, followed them down the slope and back up again in a confused tangle. "You were definitely here," he said carefully, "but there's nothing else." Marcus stood in the spot where the 9th cairn should have been and felt the last pieces of his rational world crumble away. They thought he was crazy. They thought the stress had broken him, just like it had after Sarah. And maybe they were right. Maybe everything that had happened in the night was some elaborate hallucination, his trauma-broken brain manufacturing monsters to explain the inexplicable. But when he pulled out his phone to check the time, he found a text message from an unknown number sent at 4:47 a.m. "The cold remembers you now, Marcus. It knows your taste. When the temperature drops, we'll be waiting." The message was accompanied by a photo. Marcus opened it with shaking hands. It showed him from last night, taken from a high angle, from above, where the ravens would have been. In the photo, he was on his knees in the snow, and his face was tilted up toward the camera. His eyes in the photo were catching the headlamp light and reflecting it back in amber. Marcus deleted the message, powered off his phone, and told the team he'd been mistaken about the location. They spent another 6 hours searching the area before Henderson called it off. Kayla Morrison was officially listed as missing, presumed dead due to environmental factors. Her parents would be notified. The case would remain open, but inactive. That night, alone in his cabin, Marcus packed his essentials. He'd put in for a transfer within the hour, somewhere warm, somewhere the temperature never dropped low enough for the cold to remember him. Florida, maybe, or New Mexico, somewhere the ravens didn't gather. But as he loaded his truck in the darkness, he felt the temperature drop. Just a few degrees at first, then a few more. The thermometer on his porch read 53, then 47, then 39. In the tree line at the edge of his property, Marcus saw movement. Dark figures standing perfectly still, watching, waiting. The cold was patient. The cold could follow. The cold had been here long before the parks were established, before rangers walked these trails, before anyone thought to map this wilderness and pretend it could be managed. And the hunger, that was patient too. Marcus got in his truck and drove. He didn't stop driving until the thermometer read 72 degrees and the landscape was flat and featureless, and there wasn't a mountain in sight. But even then, even hundreds of miles from Glacier National Park, he felt it sometimes when the sun went down and the temperature dropped just a little. The hunger, waiting. The cold, remembering. And somewhere in the mountains, Kayla Morrison and the others walked the trails after dark. Their transformation complete, their own hunger never satisfied. They'd wait for the next hiker who strayed too far from the marked paths. The next person who dismissed the warnings as superstition. The next victim the cold would claim. Because that's what the Wendigo did. That's what it had always done, long before anyone had a name for it. It waited in the cold places and the hungry places. And it taught people that there were appetites that couldn't be satisfied, that there were transformations that couldn't be undone, that there were prices for wandering alone in the wilderness that no one mentioned in the trail guides. Marcus never returned to Glacier, but he heard years later that another ranger had disappeared on the Highline Trail. Then another. Always in October. Always when an unexpected cold front moved through. Always on the North Trails, where the ravens circled but never landed. And he understood what he should have understood from the beginning. There are places in this world where the old rules still apply. Places where the hunger isn't metaphor but reality. Places where the cold isn't just weather but something alive, something waiting, something that remembers every person it's ever touched. He'd been one of the lucky ones. He'd gotten out. But late at night, when the temperature dropped and he felt that particular quality of cold that seemed to reach past his skin and into something deeper, Marcus would check the locks on his doors and windows. He'd turn up the heat until his small apartment was stifling. And he'd remember the figures in the trees and Kayla Morrison's amber eyes and the promise the cold had made. We'll be waiting, and he knew, with the terrible certainty that comes from having looked directly at something you were never meant to see, that they were keeping that promise. They were waiting. They were always waiting. And one day when his guard was down or his luck ran out or the temperature dropped just a little too far, they'd find him again. The cold always did. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. Sarah Brennan's thermal imaging camera picked up the heat signature at 11:47 p.m. Human-shaped, 98 degrees, standing motionless in 40-degree weather without visible clothing or shelter, 3 miles from the nearest trail. She adjusted the FLIR Scout to 3, thinking the device had malfunctioned. The thermal bloom remained consistent. A human form, radiating body heat, positioned at coordinates N48.5167, W1 21.0842, roughly 200 yards northeast of Cascade Pass. The elevation read 5,147 feet according to her Garmin GPS. Sarah had been tracking Tyler Dawson for 6 days, and this was the first concrete lead since his Subaru had been found abandoned at the Cascade Pass trailhead, with the driver's door open and his wallet still in the cup holder. The rational part of Sarah's mind, the part that had earned her a master's degree in environmental science before joining the Park Service, cataloged the impossibilities. Air temperature, 42 degrees. Wind chill, 34. No tent visible in thermal. No fire signature. No heat signature from clothing layers. Just exposed human skin, maintaining core temperature in conditions that should induce hypothermia within hours. She keyed her Motorola radio. Dispatch Ranger Brennan. I have a possible visual on Dawson. Requesting backup to coordinates November 48.5167, Whiskey 121.0842. Static answered her. Then silence. She tried again. Nothing. Sarah checked her phone. No signal, which was normal this deep in the North Cascades backcountry. The satellite phone had stopped working 2 days ago. Something about atmospheric interference the technician couldn't explain. She'd requisitioned a replacement, but it wouldn't arrive until Wednesday. The thermal signature hadn't moved. Still standing. Still impossibly warm. Sarah had been a ranger for 11 years, the last 4 in North Cascades. She'd found lost hikers, recovered bodies, talked down suicide attempts, and once tranquilized a black bear that had wandered into Stehekin. She approached problems methodically, relied on data, trusted her equipment. The thermal camera didn't lie. Someone was out there. She marked the coordinates in her GPS, shouldered her pack, and started toward the signature. The trail disappeared within 50 yards, absorbed by old-growth Douglas fir and western hemlock. Her headlamp cut weak illumination through darkness so complete it felt textured. The forest absorbed sound here, deadening even her footsteps until she moved through silence thick enough to taste. Tyler Dawson had been 23, a graduate student at University of Washington studying forest ecology. His research focused on mycorrhizal networks, the fungal connections between tree roots that some scientists called the wood wide web. His advisor had reported him missing when he failed to return from a solo research trip. That was September 28th. Today was October 4th. 7 days was a long time to survive in these mountains, especially this time of year. The nights dropped below freezing. Early snow wasn't uncommon. Tyler's emergency beacon had never been activated. His tent and supplies were missing from his car, which suggested he'd made it into the backcountry, but searchers had found no trace of him on any established trail. Sarah checked the thermal camera again. The signature had moved. Now it was 300 yards away, still northeast, higher in elevation. She recalculated. The figure was climbing, moving upslope toward the ridgeline where the Cascade crest met the Ptarmigan Traverse. Tyler Dawson! Her voice died in the trees, swallowed before the echo could form. Tyler, if you can hear me, stay where you are. Park Service. The thermal signature stopped moving. For perhaps 20 seconds, it remained stationary. Then it turned. She watched the heat bloom rotate and faced her direction. Sarah's throat went dry. The distance was too great for normal human hearing, especially with the forest's acoustic dampening. But the figure had stopped exactly when she shouted, as if it had heard her, as if it had been waiting to hear her. She continued forward, now acutely aware of every sound her boots made against the undergrowth. The terrain grew steeper. Her breath came harder. At 5,900 feet, the air carried less oxygen than her body wanted, and she'd already hiked 9 miles that day. Her quadriceps burned. She focused on the pain because it was quantifiable, real, something her mind could catalog and contextualize. The thermal signature remained motionless, waiting. Sarah emerged into a small clearing where a rockslide had torn through the forest sometime in the past decade. Moonlight penetrated here, turning everything silver and shadow. She killed her headlamp, letting her eyes adjust. The thermal camera showed the figure approximately 100 yards ahead, just beyond the clearing's far edge. That's when she smelled it. The odor arrived on a wind that shouldn't exist in the clearing's protected bowl. Cold air that tasted of iron and rot and something else. Something that reminded Sarah of the cadaver lab where she'd taken anatomy as an undergraduate. Decomposition had a specific chemical signature, putrescine and cadaverine, the aptly named compounds produced when tissue broke down. But this smell carried an additional note, sharp and alkaline, like ammonia mixed with spoiled meat. Sarah pulled her flashlight and swept it across the clearing's far edge. The beam caught something reflective. Eyes, she thought at first. Then she registered the objects properly. Metal, specifically carabiners and climbing hardware scattered across the rocks like breadcrumbs. She approached carefully, documenting each item with her phone's camera. A black diamond carabiner, a Petzl belay device, 50 feet of climbing rope, cut cleanly through the middle. The rope's ends weren't frayed from wear. They'd been severed deliberately, the synthetic fibers showing the characteristic melt pattern of a hot blade. Sarah bagged the evidence, marking each with coordinates and timestamps. The equipment was high quality, well-maintained, recent. She checked Tyler's gear list from his missing person report. He'd brought climbing equipment. His research site required accessing steep terrain where certain mycorrhizal species grew. The thermal camera showed no heat signature now. The figure had vanished. Sarah swept the device in a full circle. Nothing. No heat blooms anywhere within its 200-yard range. The forest had swallowed whoever, whatever, had been standing there. She keyed her radio again. Still dead. She tried her phone. Still no signal. The satellite phone remained broken. Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years of backcountry work. The specific crystallization of fear that comes from realizing you're utterly alone, with no means of communication, no way to call for help, and evidence suggesting something is very wrong. The professional part of her brain insisted on rationality. The figure had been human. Humans showed up on thermal imaging as heat signatures. The person had simply moved beyond the camera's range. The climbing equipment was Tyler's, and its presence here meant he'd come this way. She was doing her job, following evidence, documenting findings, conducting a search and rescue operation. But another part of her brain, older, more primitive, registered the wrongness saturating this place. The absolute silence, the smell, the way the thermal signature had moved impossibly fast across terrain that should have taken 10 minutes to traverse. The cut rope. Sarah marked the location in her GPS and continued northeast, following the direction the figure had traveled. The forest closed around her again, and she turned her headlamp back on. The beam showed nothing unusual, just trees, undergrowth, the typical dense vegetation of Pacific Northwest old growth. But the smell grew stronger with each step, that mixture of decay and chemical wrongness that made her sinuses burn. She found Tyler's tent at 1:33 a.m. It had been set up in a small depression, tucked among the trees in a location that offered good shelter from wind and rain. The tent itself was intact, a Mountain Hardware 3-season model, properly staked, rainfly secured. Everything about the setup suggested a careful, experienced camper who knew what he was doing. Sarah approached slowly, her hand moving to the canister of bear spray on her belt. Tyler Dawson, it's Park Service. Are you in there? No response. The tent's zipper was closed. She circled the campsite first, documenting everything with her phone's camera. Tyler's boots sat outside the tent's entrance, neatly placed as if he'd simply stepped out of them before going inside. His backpack leaned against a tree properly hung on a bear line away from the sleeping area. A camping stove sat on a flat rock, clean, the fuel canister still attached. Everything was orderly. Everything was correct. Everything was wrong. The smell was overwhelming here, so thick she could feel it coating her throat. Sarah pulled out a bandana and tied it around her nose and mouth. Her hands were shaking. She noticed this clinically, the way she'd noticed data during a research study. Elevated heart rate, increased respiration, pupils probably dilated, classic fight or flight response. She grabbed the tent's zipper pull and drew it down slowly. The tent was empty, completely empty. No sleeping bag, no clothes, no gear, just bare tent floor and the smell pouring out like a physical presence, making her gag despite the bandana. Sarah stepped back, fighting nausea. The tent shouldn't be empty. Tyler's boots were outside. His pack was here. The tent was zipped closed. Where were his belongings? Where was his sleeping bag? She searched the surrounding area with her flashlight. Nothing. No sign of a struggle. No blood. No torn fabric. Just the abandoned tent and Tyler's perfectly arranged campsite and that god-awful smell emanating from the empty interior. The thermal camera showed nothing. No heat signatures anywhere nearby. Sarah documented everything methodically, taking photos from multiple angles. recording GPS coordinates, making voice notes on her phone. This was evidence. This was data. Data could be analyzed, understood, explained. The rational explanation started forming in her mind. Tyler had abandoned his campsite. Some kind of medical emergency, maybe. Altitude sickness causing confusion. He'd taken his sleeping bag and wandered off, leaving behind the tent and boots. It didn't make complete sense, but human behavior under stress often didn't. People did irrational things when hypothermic, when oxygen deprived, when scared. That's when she found the marks. They started at the tent's entrance and led northeast, deeper into the forest. Not quite footprints, not quite drag marks. Something in between. Sarah crouched down, examining them with her flashlight. The impressions in the soft earth were elongated, roughly human-sized. But the pattern was wrong. Too widely spaced. The depth inconsistent, as if whatever made them had been moving with an unusual gait. She photographed the marks, placed a compass for scale, noted the direction. Northeast. Always northeast, toward the higher elevations where the tree line gave way to alpine terrain. Sarah followed the trail. She had no choice. This was what rangers did. You followed the evidence. You found the lost. You brought people home. The marks led up slope for approximately a quarter mile before they stopped abruptly at a patch of bare granite. Sarah swept her flashlight across the rock face. No blood, no tissue, no sign of what had happened here. The trail simply ended, as if the person making it had been lifted straight up into the air. She looked up. The trees formed a canopy overhead, their branches interlocked in patterns that seemed deliberate, geometric, wrong. Sarah had a degree in forest ecology. She understood how trees grew, how their branches competed for sunlight, how the canopy structure developed over decades. These branches formed shapes that shouldn't occur naturally, angles too precise, spacing too regular. The thermal camera showed a heat signature directly above her. Sarah's breath caught. The figure was in the trees 20 feet up, clinging to a branch that shouldn't support human weight. The thermal bloom was the same as before. 98 degrees, human-shaped, impossibly positioned. Tyler? Her voice came out as a whisper. The heat signature moved, not climbing down, moving laterally, branch to branch, with a fluid grace that defied physics. No human could move like that. No human should be able to. Sarah ran. She didn't decide to run. Her body made the choice, some ancient survival circuit overriding her rational mind. She crashed through the undergrowth, branches tearing at her face, roots catching her boots. Her headlamp beam bounced wildly, showing snapshots of forest that looked increasingly alien. Trees leaning at impossible angles, rocks arranged in patterns, shadows that moved independently of her light. Behind her she heard something following, not footsteps, something else. A wet sliding sound like meat dragging across stone. And underneath it, barely audible, a sound that might have been breathing or might have been words in a language she didn't know. Sarah's GPS showed she was heading west, back toward the trail system. Her rational mind reasserted itself enough to navigate. She needed to reach the trailhead, needed to get to her truck, needed to call for backup, bring a team, approach this properly with resources and personnel, and the thermal camera, still gripped in her left hand, showed 3 heat signatures now. 1 behind her, 2 ahead, blocking her path. She skidded to a stop, breath tearing at her lungs. The figures appeared in her headlamp beam, 2 shapes that were nearly human but not quite, standing motionless in the trail ahead. They wore remnants of outdoor clothing, shreds of Gore-Tex and fleece hanging from emaciated frames. Their skin was the color of freezer-burned meat, stretched too tight over bones that seemed wrong, articulated in ways human skeletons shouldn't allow. Their eyes reflected her light like an animal's eyeshine, but the reflection was wrong. White instead of green or amber, as if something behind the eyes was glowing from within. One of them opened its mouth. The jaw distended farther than human anatomy permitted, revealing teeth that had been filed to points. When it spoke, the words came out in a voice like wind through a canyon, hollow and cold and utterly inhuman. Brennan. It knew her name. We've been hungry so long. Sarah's hand found her bear spray, but her fingers were numb with cold and fear. The canister slipped from her grip and disappeared into the undergrowth. The two figures didn't move. They just stood there, swaying slightly, as if the forest wind was blowing through them instead of around them. The thermal camera in her other hand showed all three signatures now, the two ahead and one behind, closing in. They were surrounding her. Sarah's master's degree hadn't prepared her for this. Her 11 years as a ranger hadn't prepared her for this. Nothing in her rational, scientific worldview had prepared her for the moment when reality bent enough to show what lived underneath. What are you? The words came out steady despite everything. She was proud of that steadiness, held on to it like a lifeline. The figure's head tilted, considering her question. Up close, she could see that its neck was too long, vertebrae visible through translucent skin. We were hungry, it repeated. Now we are hunger. The forest provides, and we consumed. We consumed until there was nothing left to consume but ourselves, and then we consumed that too. Now we are what remains when hunger consumes hunger. The Wendigo. The word surfaced from an anthropology course she'd taken in graduate school, Algonquian mythology. A spirit of insatiable hunger that possessed those who resorted to cannibalism, transforming them into monsters that could never be satisfied. She'd written a paper on indigenous North American folklore, analyzed it as cultural metaphor, environmental adaptation, cautionary tale about resource scarcity in harsh climates. She'd never considered it might be real. Tyler Dawson, Sarah said, still holding on to that steadiness. Where is he? The figure smiled. Its teeth were blackened stumps behind the sharpened incisors. Dawson consumed his morals first, then his compassion, then his research, his ambitions, his love for his family. He consumed every memory that made him human. Now he consumes only flesh, and even that doesn't satisfy. It gestured behind Sarah with one elongated arm. You've been speaking with him all night. Sarah turned slowly. The third heat signature stood 15 feet away, close enough now for her headlamp to illuminate properly. This one wore the ragged remains of a University of Washington sweatshirt. Its face was Tyler Dawson's face, recognizable from the missing person photos, but transformed. Cheekbones jutting like knives, eyes sunken into pits of shadow, skin pulled so tight it had split in places, showing yellow fat beneath. Tyler's mouth opened. Run! The word came out in 2 syllables, stretched and distorted. Run before I forget why I'm telling you to run. Sarah ran. She ran southwest, abandoning any pretense of navigation, crashing through forest so thick it was nearly impassable. Behind her, she heard them following, 3 sets of whatever they used instead of footsteps, moving through the darkness with horrible efficiency. They could see in the dark, she realized. They didn't need light. They were perfectly adapted to this environment, and she was prey. Her headlamp died at 2:17 a.m. The batteries shouldn't have been dead. She'd replaced them that morning, but the light flickered twice and went out, leaving her in darkness so complete she literally couldn't see her hand in front of her face. Sarah stopped, lungs burning, completely disoriented. She pulled out her phone. The screen showed no signal, no GPS lock, and the battery indicator read 0% despite being fully charged hours ago. The thermal camera still worked. Sarah held it up with shaking hands, watching the 3 heat signatures converge on her position from different directions. They were coordinating, herding her, pushing her toward something. She heard water, running water, which meant a creek, which meant she could follow it downhill, find the valley floor, locate a trail. Sarah stumbled toward the sound, using the camera's faint screen glow as her only light. Her boots found water, and she waded in, letting the current guide her. The cold was immediate and total, soaking through her waterproof hiking boots in seconds. October water in the Cascades came directly from snowmelt and glaciers. She had maybe 10 minutes before hypothermia set in. The 3 heat signatures had stopped at the creek's edge. Sarah risked a glance back with the thermal camera. They were standing there, motionless, as if the water formed some kind of barrier they couldn't or wouldn't cross. Sarah kept moving downstream, teeth chattering, body shaking. The rational part of her brain noted the symptoms. Stage 1 hypothermia. Core temperature dropping. Muscular function degrading. She needed to get out of the water, get dry, get warm. The creek widened, and Sarah stumbled out onto a gravel bar. Dawn was starting to break, just enough light to make out basic shapes. She could see the creek, the surrounding forest, the slope of the mountain above. Normal. Everything looked normal. She checked the thermal camera. No heat signatures. They were gone. Sarah made it back to her truck at 6:43 a.m. Her hands were so numb she could barely grip the key. The engine started on the third try, and she cranked the heat to maximum, sitting in the cab, while her body slowly remembered how to feel warm. Her satellite phone sat on the passenger seat, still broken. Her regular phone showed 3 bars of signal now that she was at the trailhead. She called dispatch, told them she'd found evidence of Tyler Dawson's campsite, but no sign of Tyler himself, provided coordinates, requested additional search teams, spoke calmly, professionally, giving facts without interpretation. She didn't mention the thermal signatures, didn't mention the figures in the forest, didn't mention Tyler's transformed face or the impossible movements or the smell of decay that still clung to her clothing despite the freezing creek water. What could she say? That she'd encountered something that shouldn't exist? That the missing person had been transformed into some kind of monster from indigenous folklore? That there were at least 3 of these things in the North Cascades backcountry? She'd sound insane. More importantly, she'd sound unscientific, irrational, unreliable. Everything Sarah had built her career on, methodical observation, empirical evidence, data-driven conclusions, would be undermined by one report about impossible creatures in the forest. But she had evidence. Sarah pulled out her phone and opened the photo gallery. The pictures she'd taken showed Tyler's campsite, the climbing equipment, the marks in the ground. But when she zoomed in on the images, she saw nothing. Just forest. Just trees. The photos showed empty clearings where she'd documented Tyler's tent. Bare ground where the climbing gear had been scattered. Normal branches where she'd seen geometric patterns. The thermal camera's memory was worse. Every heat signature she'd recorded showed as corrupted data, pixels scattered into meaningless noise. The GPS coordinates were wrong too, pointing to locations that were impossible, coordinates that would put her in the middle of solid granite or 1,000 feet in the air. Sarah sat in her truck, staring at the evidence that wasn't evidence, the proof that proved nothing. The search teams arrived at 9:15 a.m. 6 rangers, 3 search and rescue volunteers, 2 K9 units. They found nothing. Tyler Dawson's campsite didn't exist. The climbing equipment was never recovered. The marks in the forest floor had vanished. When they reached the coordinates Sarah had provided, they found only undisturbed wilderness. Maybe you were more exhausted than you realized, the incident commander suggested gently. Night hiking at altitude, high stress, you'd been out there for 15 hours. It's easy to get disoriented. Sarah didn't argue. What was the point? The evidence had erased itself. Reality had reasserted itself, covering over the cracks she'd glimpsed underneath. She went home, took a shower hot enough to hurt, made coffee, sat at her kitchen table and stared at the wall. Everything was normal. Her apartment was normal. The sunrise through her window was normal. The sounds of traffic outside were normal. Except Sarah couldn't stop seeing those 3 figures standing in the darkness. Couldn't stop hearing that hollow voice saying, "Hunger, consuming hunger." Couldn't stop remembering Tyler Dawson's face. Still recognizable. Still human enough to tell her to run. She opened her laptop and started researching. Not as a ranger. As someone who'd seen something impossible and needed to understand it. The Wendigo appeared throughout Algonquian cultures, Ojibwe, Cree, Innu, Naskapi. A spirit of greed and hunger that possessed humans, transforming them into cannibalistic monsters. Some versions described them as giants made of ice, others as emaciated figures with hearts of frozen blood. All the accounts agreed on one detail. Once transformed, A Wendigo could never be satisfied. Its hunger only grew. Sarah found academic papers analyzing Wendigo psychosis, a culture-bound syndrome where individuals became convinced they would transform into the creature. She found anthropological studies examining the Wendigo as metaphor for colonialism's insatiable consumption. She found modern cryptozoology sites mixing legitimate folklore with sensationalized nonsense. But she also found patterns, reports of disappearances in northern forests, unexplained cases where experienced outdoorsmen vanished without trace, cold cases where search teams found campsites abandoned mid-meal, supplies intact, no sign of struggle. The incidents clustered in remote wilderness areas across the northern United States and Canada, concentrated in regions where Algonquian peoples had lived for millennia. The data suggested something, not proof. Sarah was too rigorous a scientist to call this proof, but a pattern suggesting that maybe folklore preserved truths that modernity preferred to deny. She compiled the information into a private document, organizing it with the same methodical precision she applied to her ranger reports: incident locations, dates, victim profiles, environmental conditions. She didn't know what she'd do with the data, but collecting it felt like maintaining sanity. This was what Sarah did. She observed, documented, analyzed, even when the subject was impossible. 3 weeks later, another hiker went missing in North Cascades. This time it was a solo backpacker named Jennifer Nakamura, last seen on the Thunder Creek Trail. Sarah was assigned to the search team. She found Jennifer's thermal signature on the third day, standing motionless at 6,200 feet elevation, radiating 98 degrees in freezing weather. When Sarah called out, the figure turned and looked at her with eyes that reflected light like mirrors. "Brennan." The voice was Jennifer's, but hollowed out, echoing from some internal cavity that shouldn't exist. "We're so hungry. Won't you join us?" Sarah didn't run this time. She stood there in the darkness and understood with perfect clarity what was happening. The Wendigo wasn't just a spirit or a monster or a metaphor. It was a condition, a transformation, something that could spread, could convert, could multiply through the vast wilderness until there were dozens of them. Hundreds, moving through the forests and waiting for the next solo hiker, the next unprepared camper, the next person who wandered too far from safety. Tyler Dawson hadn't been the first. Jennifer Nakamura wouldn't be the last. "No," Sarah said clearly. "I won't." She turned and walked away. Behind her, she heard Jennifer, who wasn't Jennifer anymore, calling her name, voice rising to a shriek that sounded like wind through empty bones. Sarah didn't look back. She hiked out, reported finding no trace of the missing person, filed her paperwork with appropriate professional detachment. She put in her transfer request the next day. There were ranger positions in the desert Southwest, in grasslands, in tropical preserves where the trees didn't grow thick enough to hide things that shouldn't exist. She couldn't fight what was happening in these forests. She couldn't stop it. She couldn't even prove it existed. But she could refuse to feed it. She could warn people subtly through updated backcountry safety briefings and carefully worded danger advisories. She could advocate for buddy systems, for required check-ins, for anything that kept hikers from being alone in the deep wilderness where hunger waited with infinite patience. Sarah's transfer was approved in December. She left the North Cascades on a clear winter morning, drove south toward a position in Olympic National Park. Coastal forests, different ecology, different folklore, maybe different monsters, or maybe none at all. As she crossed the park boundary for the last time, her rearview mirror showed something standing at the edge of the road. Human-shaped but wrong, watching her leave with eyes that caught the morning light and reflected it back as pure white. Sarah kept driving. She didn't stop. She didn't look back. She drove until the mountains were behind her and the forest was someone else's responsibility. And the memory of that hollow voice saying, "Hunger consuming hunger," was something she could almost convince herself had been exhaustion, altitude, stress. Almost. At night, when she closed her eyes, Sarah still saw thermal signatures moving through the darkness, still heard Tyler Dawson telling her to run, still felt the weight of knowing that some things were real despite being impossible, and that sometimes the most rational choice was to flee from truth rather than confront it. She never went back to the North Cascades, never followed up on the Tyler Dawson case, never investigated the 3 additional disappearances that occurred in that region over the following year. She filed her reports, did her job, helped tourists and educated visitors, and maintained trails. But Sarah Brennan stopped hiking alone, stopped going into the deep wilderness, stopped trusting the darkness, because she'd learned that hunger could consume everything: compassion, morality, humanity itself, until nothing remained but the endless need to feed. And she'd learned that once you saw what lived in the spaces between trees, it never stopped seeing you back. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. The moss was wrong. Christopher Valdez had been staring at the western hemlock for 11 minutes, his field notebook forgotten in his hand, because the moss was growing upward instead of north. Not just this tree, he'd counted 47 so far, all within a quarter-mile radius of mile marker 8, all with thick mats of Isothecium myoceroides climbing toward the canopy like green water flowing upstream. Christopher pressed his thumb against the bark, felt the spongy vegetation pulse with moisture. The Hoh rainforest received 12 feet of rain annually, creating conditions where moss carpeted every surface in verdant excess, but it followed rules. Phototropism, moisture gradients, the Earth's magnetic field. Moss didn't just decide to grow in impossible directions. Yet here it was, defying basic biology in a perfect circle, roughly 300 yards across. He checked his Silva compass for the 4th time. The needle trembled, settled on north. His Garmin GPS confirmed his position, 47.8575 degree N, 123.9346 degree W, elevation 578 feet, Hoh River Trail, Olympic National Park. Everything normal except the moss, and the fact that Brandon Mitchell had been missing for 36 hours somewhere in this sector. Christopher had worked for the National Park Service for 6 years, long enough to develop a reputation. While other rangers told campfire stories about missing hikers walking in circles or tourists hearing voices in the trees, Christopher documented, measured, and usually found mundane explanations. Panic attacks causing disorientation, dehydration leading to poor decisions. The forest was dangerous enough without inventing mysteries, but the moss was wrong, and Christopher couldn't explain it. He photographed the anomaly with his Canon, making sure the compass was visible in the frame, then continued up the trail. Brandon Mitchell, 22, had last been seen by his hiking companion 3 mornings ago near mile marker 9. The companion, a college roommate named Aaron, had woken to find Brandon gone from their tent, his backpack and boots still inside. Aaron had searched for 2 hours before hiking out to report it, and the search and rescue operation had been running ever since. Christopher had volunteered for the solo patrol of this section, while the main SAR team worked the higher elevations. As lead ranger for the Southern Hoh District, he knew this trail intimately, every switchback, every creek crossing, every campsite. He'd walked it hundreds of times in 6 years, memorized the placement of nurse logs and the angles of ancient Sitka spruces. The Hoh was as familiar as his own apartment, which made it stranger when he reached mile marker 9 and didn't recognize anything. The trail looked right. Same packed earth, same western red cedars crowding close, same endless green pressing in from all sides. But the feeling was wrong, like walking into your childhood home and finding all the furniture moved 3 inches to the left. Christopher stopped, studied the forest. A massive Douglas fir he should have remembered stood 50 yards to his east, its trunk easily 15 feet in diameter. Had that always been there? His radio crackled. "Valdez, this is base. What's your 20? "Mile marker 9, Christopher said, pressing the transmit button on his Motorola. "Beginning search pattern Alpha, no sign of the subject yet." "Copy that. Be advised, we've had 2 other hikers report disorientation in your sector over the past week. Both were experienced. One swore the trail markers had moved." Christopher felt something cold settle in his chest, unrelated to the 48-degree temperature. Define disorientation. Both lost the trail for several hours despite having GPS. One said the trees looked different every time she turned around. The other, static interrupted, claimed the forest was breathing. Breathing. Her words, not mine. Both eventually found their way out, but they were pretty shaken. Just keep your wits about you, Chris. This section's been weird lately. Christopher wanted to ask what weird meant in objective terms, but just acknowledged and clipped the radio back to his belt. He'd requested the solo patrol because he thought he could bring some rationality to the situation, document it properly, maybe find some environmental factor everyone else had missed. Magnetic anomaly, gas seepage, something with a scientific explanation. The moss growing upward, the trees feeling wrong. Now reports of spatial disorientation. He pushed forward, following the trail north. Brandon Mitchell's file had mentioned he was studying mycology, documenting mushroom species in the rainforest for a class project. Christopher scanned the forest floor looking for signs someone had gone off trail to photograph fungi. The Ho was a mycologist's paradise. Turkey tail, artist's conch, coral fungus in shades of purple and orange, chanterelles hidden in the moss, easy to wander off path following a specimen. 20 minutes later, Christopher found Brandon's camera. It was sitting on a fallen log 10 yards off the trail, lens cap still on, completely dry despite the morning's rain. Christopher approached carefully, documented its position with photos and GPS coordinates before touching it. Canon Rebel T3i, amateur but decent. He turned it on. Battery at 63%. Memory card showed 347 photos. Christopher scrolled through them, watching Brandon's hiking trip in reverse. Shots of Aaron grinning at their campsite. Bracket fungi in artistic close-ups. The trail at dawn. Then the photos got strange. The timestamp showed they were taken after Brandon had allegedly disappeared. Photos from 4 a.m., 3 hours after Aaron claimed to have woken and found his friend gone. But they weren't selfies or accidental trigger presses. They were deliberate compositions of the forest at night, flash illuminating tree trunks in stark white light. Except the trees were wrong. In every photo, the bark had patterns, whorls and spirals that looked almost like text, or faces, or both. Christopher zoomed in. The patterns were formed by natural bark texture, but the arrangement was too deliberate, too uniform. Every tree in every photo showed the same spiral motif, as if something had organized them. The final photo made Christopher's breath catch. It showed a figure standing between two trees about 30 yards distant. The flash had caught it mid-motion, blurred, but the silhouette was wrong. Too tall, limbs too long, head tilted at an angle that should have broken a human neck. The figure's eyes reflected the flash like an animal's, white and bright. Christopher checked the photo's metadata. Taken at 4:17 a.m. 2 days ago. He looked at the forest around him, suddenly aware of how quiet it had become. The Ho was never silent. Varied thrush calls, Pacific wren songs, the constant whisper of wind through hemlock needles. But now he heard nothing except his own breathing. He pulled out his radio. "Base, this is Valdez. I've located the subject's camera at coordinates 47.862 degree N, 123.9389 degree W. No sign of the subject, but the camera contains unusual photographs. Requesting backup for this sector." Static answered him. He tried again, adjusted the frequency, checked the battery. Full power, but only white noise responded. Christopher had never experienced radio failure in this area before. The Rangers had installed 3 repeaters specifically to ensure coverage throughout the Ho Valley. He was about to try his cell phone when he noticed the trees. They'd moved. Not dramatically, not in any way he could prove if questioned later, but the massive Douglas fir he'd noted earlier was now on his right instead of his left. The angle of the trail had changed. Even the quality of light filtering through the canopy seemed different, greener somehow, more submarine. Christopher pulled out his compass. The needle spun lazily, unable to settle on north. His GPS showed his position, but the numbers kept flickering, changing by fractions of a degree, even though he stood perfectly still. He watched the coordinates dance. 47.86112, 47.8614, 47.86109. Spatial distortion, he said aloud, his voice strange in the silence. Environmental magnetic anomaly. There has to be a geological explanation. The forest didn't answer. Christopher marked the camera's location with orange flagging tape, then continued north, following what he hoped was still the trail. He needed to document this properly, take systematic measurements, prove there was a rational explanation for what was happening. Brandon Mitchell was somewhere in this forest, probably experiencing the same disorientation, and Christopher needed to find him before panic led to worse decisions. The trail climbed gradually, following the contour of an ancient river terrace. Nurse logs the size of buses lay across the path, their trunks hollowed by centuries of decay, supporting rows of young hemlocks that grew from their decomposing wood. This was the nurse log Christopher had catalogued as NL47 in his personal forest survey. He recognized the distinctive three-pronged split in its center, except NL47 should have been half a mile south. Christopher stopped, took out his field notebook, flipped through his meticulous records. There, he'd mapped this entire section 2 months ago, noted every significant landmark. This nurse log was documented at coordinates 47.8589 degree non 123, sine 371.W, which meant it should be 23/100ths of a degree south of his current position. But here it was. And worse, he was starting to recognize other features that should have been elsewhere. A distinctive red alder with a lightning scar. A creek crossing marked by 3 stepping stones. A devil's club patch arranged in a rough semicircle. All of them present, all of them wrong, as if the forest had taken pieces of itself and rearranged them like a puzzle. Christopher's hand started to shake. He forced himself to breathe slowly, analytically. There had to be an explanation. GPS error, compass malfunction, some form of déjà vu making him think he recognized landmarks that were actually different. He'd read about how human pattern recognition could create false connections, how the brain invented familiarity in unfamiliar situations. But the moss was still growing upward. He kept walking, documenting everything with photos and notes, trying to ignore how the trail ahead seemed to curve in ways it shouldn't, how the spacing between trees felt mathematically wrong, how even the rain, which had started again, fell at angles that defied simple wind patterns. That's when Christopher found the first marker. It wasn't a trail blaze or a survey ribbon. It was carved directly into the trunk of an old-growth Sitka spruce about 7 feet up, a spiral pattern identical to the ones in Brandon Mitchell's photographs. The carving was old, weathered, filled with moss, but unmistakably deliberate. Christopher photographed it, then noticed another tree 50 yards ahead bore the same mark, then another beyond that. He followed the spirals deeper into the forest, leaving the trail without entirely meaning to. The markers led him through impossibly dense undergrowth that seemed to part as he approached, past clusters of bleeding heart flowers that shouldn't bloom in October, around trees that grew in formations he'd never seen. Perfect circles, radiating lines, geometric patterns that nature didn't naturally create. The markers led him to a clearing he absolutely knew didn't exist. Christopher had surveyed every accessible acre of this sector. There were no clearings within 5 miles of the Hoh River Trail. The forest here was temperate rainforest at its most dense, every inch of ground contested by competing vegetation. Yet here was a space roughly 40 feet in diameter, absolutely bare except for moss and a single object in its center: Brandon Mitchell's backpack. Christopher approached slowly, every instinct screaming that this was wrong, that he should turn back, radio for help, get out of this sector. But his radio didn't work, and Brandon Mitchell was missing, and the backpack was right there, sitting perfectly upright on the moss as if carefully placed. He photographed it from multiple angles before touching it. Blue North Face pack, 60-liter capacity, still buckled shut. Christopher opened it carefully. Brandon's sleeping bag, dry. His food bag, untouched. Spare clothes, field journal, water bottles full. Everything a person would need to survive was here, abandoned. Christopher flipped through the field journal. Brandon's handwriting started neat, documenting mushroom species with scientific precision. Then the entries got stranger. October 23rd, found the spiral trees. Professor said impossible patterns don't exist in nature, but these do. Something's organizing them, can feel it watching. October 24th, Aaron doesn't see them, says I'm obsessed. But they're getting clearer. Like the forest is trying to show me something. Like it's trying to communicate. October 25th, the moss is growing towards something, all of it. Like compass needles pointing to a specific location. Found the center last night. Aaron was asleep. I had to see. The trees there are old, older than old, and they remember. God, they remember. The final entry was a single line, written in shaking handwriting. It's not the trees. The trees are just how it sees. Christopher looked up from the journal. The clearing was darker than it should be, though his watch showed only 2:47 p.m. The trees surrounding the space seemed taller, their canopy closing overhead like a cathedral dome. And now that he was looking, he could see the spiral patterns in their bark, all of them, arranged in concentric rings radiating from where he stood. "Brandon Mitchell!" Christopher shouted, his voice swallowed by the forest. "This is Park Ranger Valdez. If you can hear me, respond." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of presence, of attention, of something vast listening. Christopher felt it like pressure against his eardrums, like being underwater, like standing at the base of a mountain and feeling its weight press down on you from miles away. Then the trees moved, not swaying, not bending in wind. The spaces between them contracted and expanded like breathing, like the ribs of something enormous taking a breath. Christopher watched a gap between two hemlocks shrink from 6 feet to 3, watched the trunks themselves flow like melting wax, watched the forest restructure itself around him with the patient inevitability of glacial movement. He ran. Christopher crashed through the forest, abandoned protocol and rational thought, just ran. But the forest kept changing. He'd sprint toward what looked like an opening only to find it sealed by trees that hadn't been there seconds before. He'd navigate around a massive trunk and find himself back in the clearing with Brandon's backpack, as if the forest had looped him back to start. After the third loop, Christopher stopped running. His heart hammered against his ribs. His breath came in gasps, but he forced himself to stand still and think. This wasn't random. The forest was directing him, guiding him, hurting him. Whatever intelligence inhabited this place wanted him in this clearing, and it had the patience and power to ensure he stayed. Christopher pulled out Brandon's journal again, reread the entries with shaking hands. The trees are just how it sees. He looked at the spirals carved into bark, at the geometric patterns formed by their placement, at the way the clearing's shape itself suggested purpose and design. Leashy. The word came to him from a college anthropology course he'd barely remembered taking. Slavic folklore, spirits of the forest that protected their domains, that could reshape the woods at will, that punished those who showed disrespect or invaded too deeply into their territory. But that was mythology, old wives' tales from Eastern Europe. This was Olympic National Park, Washington State, 2011. There was no rational reason for Slavic forest spirits to manifest in the Pacific Northwest, unless the concept was universal. Unless what the Slavs had called Leshy was simply one name for something older, something that existed in all forests, that predated human categorization. A consciousness woven into the ecosystem itself, expressed through the patterns of growth, the arrangement of trees, the very structure of the woodland. Christopher thought about all the missing persons cases in national parks, the clusters of disappearances in specific areas, the reports of experienced hikers becoming impossibly lost. He'd always attributed it to human error, to panic and poor decision-making in wilderness environments. But what if some of those disappearances were deliberate? What if certain sections of forest simply didn't want people there? The light was fading now, though his watch showed only 3:15 p.m. Shadows stretched across the clearing, and Christopher realized they weren't shadows at all, but something more solid, more present. Dark forms moved between the trees, too fluid to be human, too purposeful to be animals. He counted 5, then 7, then lost count as they multiplied, surrounding the clearing in a ring of living darkness. One of them stepped forward. It was roughly man-shaped, but the proportions were wrong in ways that hurt to observe. Too tall, joints bending at too many angles, head elongating into something between human and tree. When it moved, leaves rustled where there were no leaves. When it breathed, the temperature dropped 5 degrees. Christopher's analytical mind tried to catalog it, find explanations. Pareidolia, the brain creating patterns from random stimuli. Hypoxia from hyperventilation, some kind of hallucinogenic spore released by the fungi Brandon had been documenting. But his hands were numb with cold. His breath fogged in the suddenly frigid air, and the thing standing 15 feet away was absolutely, undeniably real. It raised one impossibly long arm and pointed past Christopher. He turned. Behind him, another section of the clearing had opened, revealing a path through the trees he hadn't seen before. And standing at its entrance, barely visible in the gloom, was Brandon Mitchell. Brandon! Christopher took 3 steps forward before his rational mind caught up and made him stop. Brandon stood motionless, wearing the same clothes from his missing persons photo. Green flannel, jeans, hiking boots. But something was wrong with how he stood. Too still, too perfect, like a photograph instead of a person. Brandon, it's Ranger Valdez. Are you okay? Can you move? Brandon didn't respond, didn't even blink. The forest behind him was impossibly dark, and Christopher realized he couldn't see more than 10 feet down the path. It was like looking into a tunnel or a throat. The entity behind Christopher made a sound. Not speech exactly, but something that resonated in his bones, that carried meaning without language. Go. Follow. Enter. Christopher understood then. This was a choice, or the illusion of one. He could walk down that path after Brandon, into whatever waited in the deep forest, the place where the spiral trees pointed, where the moss grew toward, where the entity's consciousness pooled most densely. Maybe he'd find Brandon alive. Maybe he'd find answers to what was happening. Or maybe he'd simply become another missing person, another case file, another name on the list of people who walked into the forest and never walked out. The alternative was to refuse, to somehow navigate his way back to the trail despite the forest's interference, to leave Brandon Mitchell to whatever fate awaited him in the darkness. The rational choice. The survivable choice. Christopher thought about his 6 years with the Park Service, about the reputation he'd built for logical analysis and skeptical documentation. He thought about the moss growing upward, about the photographs in Brandon's camera, about how badly he'd wanted to explain everything away with science and reason. He thought about standing in his apartment explaining to Brandon Mitchell's parents why he hadn't tried to retrieve their son, why he'd chosen himself over a 22-year-old kid who just wanted to photograph some mushrooms. He took a step toward the path. The entity made another sound, this one almost approving, and the darkness ahead seemed to lighten fractionally. Christopher walked forward, his legs moving on autopilot while his mind screamed at him to turn back. He passed Brandon's motionless form, resisted the urge to touch him, to verify if he was real or projection or something worse. The path led deeper into the forest, and with each step, the normal rules of space seemed to dissolve further. Trees grew at impossible angles, their roots forming staircases and bridges through the air. The ground beneath Christopher's feet felt solid, but looked transparent, as if he walked on water that had forgotten how to be liquid. Above him, the canopy closed into complete darkness, no sky visible, just endless reaching branches that intertwined into patterns that suggested language, mathematics, consciousness itself expressed in wood and leaf. He passed other figures standing motionless among the trees, hikers in modern gear and ancient clothes, loggers from the 19th century, possibly indigenous peoples from centuries before that, all frozen mid-step, eyes open but unseeing, like insects preserved in amber. Christopher understood these were the others, the ones who'd walked too deep, who'd tried to understand the forest and found understanding came at a price. The path ended in another clearing, larger than the first, and Christopher felt his mind strain trying to process what he saw. The trees here were old beyond measuring, their trunks wider than houses, their bark covered in spirals that moved and shifted like living things. And in the center of the clearing stood something that might have been a tree, or might have been the entity itself. A massive presence that seemed to occupy more dimensions than Christopher's eyes could perceive. Brandon Mitchell stood before it, no longer frozen but moving in slow, dreamlike motions, his hands tracing the spirals in the bark, his lips moving soundlessly. Christopher approached him, touched his shoulder, and Brandon turned. His eyes were different. Not white like in the photograph, but filled with green light, with the bioluminescence of fungal growth, with something that was no longer entirely human. When he spoke, his voice echoed strangely, as if multiple voices spoke in harmony. "It's beautiful," Brandon said. "It's been here so long, since before humans, since before language. The forest is just the visible part. The real organism is underneath, in the mycelium networks, in the root systems, in the patterns of growth that span miles. It thinks. It remembers. It's trying to show us. Brandon, we need to leave. Now." "Leave?" Brandon smiled, and it was wrong. Too wide, too many teeth. "We're home. This is where we belong. All of us. The forest takes care of its own." He gestured at the frozen figures surrounding the clearing. "They understand now. They're part of it, part of the pattern." Christopher grabbed Brandon's arm, tried to pull him toward the path. Brandon's skin felt wrong under his hand, too cool, with a texture more like bark than flesh. "You're not thinking clearly. Whatever this thing is, it's affecting your perception. We need to get you to a hospital." "Hospital?" Brandon laughed, and the sound was like wind through hollow trees. "Christopher, there is no hospital, there is no park, there is no outside. That was all the dream. This is what's real. The forest, the pattern, the eternal growth and decay. We were always going to end up here. The spirals were always leading us home." The massive presence in the center of the clearing shifted, and Christopher felt attention focus on him like a physical weight. Images flooded his mind. The forest as it had been 10,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago before humans had arrived, when it covered the continent in unbroken green. The slow, patient consciousness that had evolved in the networks of root and fungus, that thought in seasons and centuries, that perceived time as humans perceived space. It didn't hate humans. It simply didn't recognize them as permanent. People were ephemeral things, insects that crawled across its surface for brief moments before disappearing. But sometimes the insects walked too deep, saw too much, understood too much, and then the forest had to decide whether to let them leave with that understanding or incorporate them into the pattern, make them part of the eternal structure. Christopher understood he was being offered the same choice Brandon had accepted: become part of the forest, merge consciousness with the vast intelligence that inhabited the root networks and mycelia, exist forever in the pattern of spirals and geometric growth. Or resist and face consequences he couldn't quite perceive but knew would be terrible. "No," Christopher said. The word came out weaker than he intended. "No, this isn't right. This is some kind of neurological effect. Fungal spores, airborne toxins, something with a scientific explanation. I won't accept." Pain exploded through his skull. Not physical pain, but something deeper. The sensation of his mind being rewritten, his neurons forming new connections, his consciousness being reshaped into something compatible with the forest's patterns. Christopher fell to his knees, and through the agony he felt himself starting to understand, starting to see the beauty of it. The logic of surrendering individual identity to become part of something larger, older, more permanent. He thought about his apartment in Port Angeles, about the books on his shelf and the telescope by his window, about the small separate life he'd built with its neat explanations and rational structures. He thought about everything he'd tried to prove with 6 years of documentation and skepticism, the barrier he'd built between himself and the forest's mystery. And he realized the barrier had always been artificial, that he'd been lying to himself. That part of him had always known the forest was alive in ways science couldn't measure, that the rational explanations had been comfort blankets against a truth too large to accept. The moss growing upward, the trees rearranging themselves, the sense of being watched on night patrols. It had all been real, and he'd spent 6 years explaining it away. Christopher looked up at Brandon, at the green light in his eyes, at the smile that was no longer quite human. He looked at the frozen figures around the clearing, at the massive presence in the center, at the spirals that covered every surface. He could feel the forest offering him a place in the pattern, a role in the eternal structure, an escape from the burden of individual consciousness. It would be so easy to say yes. Instead, Christopher pulled out his Motorola radio, the one that hadn't worked since he'd entered the sector. He pressed the transmit button, not expecting anything, just a gesture of defiance, a refusal to surrender his rationality, even in the face of the impossible. "Ranger Valdez to base," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm in Sector 7, beyond the trail. Coordinates impossible to determine. I've located Brandon Mitchell, but he's compromised. The forest here is hostile. Repeat, the forest is hostile. Send backup with..." The radio crackled. Through waves of static came a voice, thin and distant but unmistakably human. "Valdez, we're reading you. Your signal is weak, but we have a partial fix. Hold your position. SAR team is inbound." The effect on the clearing was immediate. The massive presence recoiled. The green light in Brandon's eyes flickered, the frozen figures stirred slightly. Christopher understood. The forest's power was absolute within its domain, but it couldn't extend beyond certain boundaries. The radio signal was a connection to the outside world, a tether to human reality, and that connection weakened the entity's control. Brandon screamed. It was a sound of rage and loss, the voice of the forest itself howling through human vocal cords. He lunged at Christopher, hands reaching for the radio. But Christopher rolled away, kept talking into the device, maintaining that fragile connection to the outside. "I'm approximately 1 mile north-northwest of mile marker 9, off-trail in an uncharted clearing. Multiple people here, some for years based on their clothing. This area needs to be marked off-limits. Do not send anyone else in alone. Do not..." Brandon struck him, and the blow had inhuman strength behind it. Christopher hit the ground hard, felt ribs crack, lost his grip on the radio. It skittered across the moss, and Christopher crawled after it desperately while Brandon stood over him, no longer quite human, becoming something else, something that belonged to the forest completely. "You can't leave," Brandon said, but his voice was wrong, layered with sounds no human throat could make. "You've seen too much. You understand too much. You're part of the pattern now, whether you accept it or not." Christopher's fingers closed on the radio. He pressed transmit. "GPS coordinates from my last known position, 47.86 degree in, 123.93 degree W. Search north of there. Look for spiral patterns carved in trees. Follow them, but don't go too deep. Don't..." The massive presence in the clearing moved. It wasn't dramatic or violent. It simply reached out with what might have been a branch or a limb or consciousness itself, and touched Christopher's mind. Everything went white. When Christopher came back to himself, he was lying on the Hoh River Trail at mile marker 8. Autumn sunlight filtered through the canopy. His Motorola radio was still in his hand, silent now. His watch showed 4:47 p.m. His GPS confirmed his position at standard coordinates with no flickering or anomalies. The moss grew north, as it should. Christopher stood slowly, inventory of injuries, cracked ribs, multiple bruises, hands torn up from crawling through underbrush. His uniform was covered in dirt and moss, his equipment scattered around him. It looked like he'd been through a physical ordeal, like he'd fallen or been in some kind of struggle. But his field notebook was gone. Brandon Mitchell's camera was gone. The photographs, the evidence, everything that could prove what he'd experienced in the clearing, all missing. Christopher tried his radio. "Valdez to base. Come in, base." "Base here." "Valdez, where the hell have you been? We lost your signal 3 hours ago." "I found Brandon Mitchell. He's..." He's not retrievable. Sector 7 needs to be closed. Mark it off limits immediately. Slow down, Chris. You found Mitchell? What do you mean, not retrievable? Christopher looked north toward where the clearing should be, though his GPS showed only unbroken forest. How could he explain? What could he say that wouldn't sound like hallucination or breakdown? The ranger who insisted on rational explanations, claiming the forest was alive and taking people. I mean, he's dead, Christopher heard himself say. The lie came automatically, protective. I found signs of a fall possibly several days ago. The terrain in that area is unstable. We'll need a recovery team, but only in daylight, and only with multiple rangers. No one goes in alone. He was lying. Brandon Mitchell wasn't dead. He was something worse. Alive, but no longer human. Part of the forest's pattern. Existing in that space between life and incorporation. But Christopher couldn't say that. Couldn't admit that he'd walked away. That he'd chosen himself over retrieving Brandon. That he'd felt the forest's consciousness and run from it. Copy that. Return to base for debriefing. SAR team will go in at first light with full support. Christopher started walking south back toward the ranger station, each step taking him further from that clearing and whatever intelligence inhabited it. He tried to tell himself it had been real, that the broken ribs and torn hands were proof, that the gaps in his memory and equipment were evidence. But already it felt dreamlike, unreal, impossible to reconcile with the rational world he'd built his identity around. They never found Brandon Mitchell's body. The recovery team went into Sector 7 at dawn, followed Christopher's directions to the area north of mile marker 9, and found nothing. No clearing, no frozen figures, no spiral patterns beyond ordinary bark texture. Christopher went with them, insisted on going despite his injuries, and couldn't locate the place where he'd spent 3 hours the previous day. The official report listed Brandon Mitchell as missing, presumed dead from exposure or accident in the Olympic wilderness. Case closed. Christopher was commended for his search efforts and given 2 weeks administrative leave to recover from his injuries. During those 2 weeks, Christopher tried to return to his apartment in Port Angeles, to his books and telescope and rational life. But he'd lie awake at night, feeling the phantom pressure of the forest's consciousness against his mind, remembering the choice he'd made to save himself instead of Brandon Mitchell. He'd stare at the ceiling and wonder if the entity was patient enough to wait, if someday he'd walk into the forest for a routine patrol and find the trees had rearranged themselves again, find the spirals carved in bark leading him back to that clearing. He requested a transfer to a different district. Request denied. The Southern Ho was his responsibility, his sector, and there was a shortage of experienced rangers. He was needed here. On his first patrol back, Christopher noticed something that made his hands shake. The moss at mile marker 8 was growing upward again. Just a few patches, easy to miss if you weren't looking, but unmistakably wrong. The forest was still there, still conscious, still waiting. And Christopher understood he would spend the rest of his career, possibly the rest of his life, walking these trails, maintaining the pretense of normalcy, keeping other rangers away from Sector 7, living with the knowledge that something vast and ancient inhabited these woods, and occasionally it took people who walked too deep or understood too much. He thought about Brandon Mitchell's journal, about the final entry. It's not the trees. The trees are just how it sees. Christopher had understood what that meant in the clearing. But now the understanding was fading, protected by his mind's defense mechanisms, rationalized away by the need to function in normal reality. But sometimes, on night patrols when the forest grew quiet and the darkness pressed close, Christopher would feel that presence again. Vast and patient and utterly inhuman, waiting for him to understand fully, to accept what he'd seen, to stop fighting against the truth that some mysteries had no rational explanation. The moss kept growing upward at mile marker 8. Every week Christopher would see it, documented in reports that went nowhere. Mark it as an anomaly no one else seemed concerned about. He'd look at those reversed patterns and know they were a message, a reminder, a promise from something that had existed in these forests for millennia before humans arrived with their science and skepticism. He never told anyone the full truth about what happened in Sector 7. How could he? He barely believed it himself most days. and the parts he did believe felt more like nightmare than memory. But the cracked ribs healed wrong, leaving a permanent ache when it rained. His hands bore scars from crawling through the undergrowth. And sometimes when he closed his eyes, he could still see that clearing, still see Brandon Mitchell's green-lit eyes, still feel the vast intelligence of the forest pressing against his mind like water against a dam. Christopher Valdez stayed with the National Park Service for another 3 years after Brandon Mitchell's disappearance. He continued his documentation, his measurements, his skeptical analysis of reported phenomena. But he marked Sector 7 as hazardous terrain on all official maps, kept hikers away from that area, and never went north of mile marker 9 alone again. The forest had offered him a choice, and he'd made it. Now he lived with the consequences. The knowledge that some doors once opened could never be fully closed. That some places in the wilderness were wild in ways science couldn't measure. That the line between the real and the impossible was thinner than he'd spent 6 years trying to prove. On foggy mornings, when the Hoh rainforest was most beautiful and most alien, Christopher would stand at the trailhead and wonder if Brandon Mitchell was still alive in that other place. If consciousness could really merge with forests and fungal networks. If somewhere beyond the mapped trails there existed clearings where lost people stood frozen in eternal contemplation of patterns that predated human thought. Then he'd check his equipment, note his coordinates, and walk the trail like the rational, skeptical ranger everyone believed him to be. And the forest would watch him with its 1,000 eyes, patient and eternal, waiting for the next person who walked too deep, who understood too much, who followed the spirals to their source. The moss kept growing upward. The trees stood in patterns no one else seemed to notice. And Christopher Valdez carried the weight of what he'd seen, what he'd chosen, what he'd left behind in Sector 7 of the Hoh rainforest on that October day, when he'd learned that being right about mysteries sometimes meant discovering some mysteries were never meant to be solved. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened.